Mr. Ambassador, nice to see you, sir.
Glad to be with you.
It's like old times.
It is.
It is like old times. I want to start big picture first. Can you tell me, compare and contrast the foreign policy, President Bush 43, President Obama, and President Trump?
Well, I think President Trump, in his campaign, said his objective was to put American national interest first. And I think that's been the hallmark of his first year plus in office. He has inherited a lot of problems, Iran, North Korea, the Middle East, that really were either not addressed or were addressed incorrectly in the Obama administration. And that's a big part of his responsibility. The Bush administration, by contrast, came in with this idea that the world's problems had been solved, the Cold War was over, economic growth was the only issue, and then we hit 9/11. So really, his presidency was very different. But I think President Trump's got a series of problems to resolve, and he's systematically working his way through it.
What's sort of interesting, because if you look back historically, like North Korea, for instance, back in the beginning, President Clinton tried to do something, and successive presidents did, and even moving the embassy in Israel, which has been a promise by the U.S. Congress in 1995. President George W. Bush said he was going to do it. President Obama said he was going to do it, and now apparently it is going to be done.
Yeah, well, this goes to the credibility of the United States, and particularly the President of the United States. So when President Trump says, like every other former successful presidential candidate, I plan to move the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, and then he does it, that's not simply something that has an effect on the conditions in Israel, but it says to world leaders all around the world, when he says he's going to do something, he does. And I think, likewise, his recent decision to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal, which he talked about all the time during the campaign and made clear even after he became president, he thought was a terrible deal. By his withdrawal, he simply carried through on what he's been saying consistently for close to 2 years.
What do you expect? Do you expect Iran to come back to the table and negotiate, or is this a standoff between the United States and Iran?
Oh, I don't think it'll be a standoff. I think inevitably as U.S. sanctions kick in, it'll have an effect on Europe. I think their trade and investment with Iran will drop as well. And I think Iran then faces a very difficult choice. They'd love to keep the deal going because of the economic benefits which all pointed in their direction. But those benefits are about to be cut off. The economy's in much more difficult shape. Even after the release of the sanctions, we saw demonstrations all around the country at the end of last year. So I think it's going to be very, very difficult for Iran to sustain this.
What's the position about regime change in Iran?
Well, that's not the objective of the administration. The objective is to prevent them from coming anywhere close to nuclear weapons. And I think as the economic benefits that Obama conferred on Iran in the deal disappear, that's the point where they say, as the North Koreans may well have said, we just can't bear this, where the cost of the nuclear weapons, in effect, is much too great.
What is the reason that the president got out of the Iran deal? I mean, the IAEA said that Iran was in compliance. There was a discussion about whether or not the money from the unfreezed assets, that the money that belonged to Iran that was returned during the Obama administration, that provided a lot of money, and that money has been distributed, and there's a lot of complaints it's distributed to Hezbollah and in Yemen and in Syria to fight Israel. Is that the reason why he got out of the deal?
Well, it's certainly the case, the way Obama negotiated the deal, that front-end benefits went to Iran. And that was one of the fundamental mistakes of it. But at its core, the deal was simply not in America's strategic interest. It did not effectively restrain Iran from continuing to pursue deliverable nuclear weapons. It did not have effective verification mechanisms. We entered the deal without knowing anything other than what our own intelligence had given us on Iran's military program. And the IAEA simply didn't have adequate provisions for inspection. So we know that at the core of the deal was a lie about Iran's military aspirations. And the recent information revealed by Israel only underscores that.
But isn't a deal, number one? And I realize that there's a lie underlined, and that's what Prime Minister Netanyahu and Israeli intelligence came up with. But isn't a deal, and doesn't that somehow inhibit the United States in making a deal with Kim Jong-un in North Korea?
Well, I don't think any deal that's based on fraud is valid, and so I think that undercuts it to begin with. But it's also the case a president has to look at the strategic interest of the United States. So when George W. Bush withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, it wasn't because Russia was violating it, although they probably was. It was because the world had changed. And I think in the case of the Iran deal, it was never in America's interest, and it wasn't getting any better with age. I actually think it increases the chances of a deal with North Korea, because North Korea will say to itself, we're obviously not going to get a deal so favorable to us as Iran, and if we want any deal at all, it's going to have to be much more on the U.S. terms.
All right, so who made the first gesture, the United States to North Korea, to Kim Jong-un, or Kim Jong-un to the United States to having this summit?
Well, you know, as President Trump says, what exactly has he given up so far? The fact is that President Clinton wanted to go to North Korea at the end of his administration. He couldn't quite work it. And other presidents have thought about it as well. We'll see, I think, very quickly. I really think President Trump is clear-eyed about the prospects here. He's optimistic because he'd like to make a deal, but I don't think we're going to get taken in like prior administrations.
What's the hint that North Korea actually wants to deal?
Well, the fact that they've most recently, again, in what's called the Panmunjom Declaration, the document that came out of the North-South Korean summit at the end of April, commits North Korea to complete denuclearization. And that means that if they're serious, if they've made a strategic decision to give up nuclear weapons, they've got a chance to demonstrate it to President Trump directly in Singapore on June the 12th. And if they haven't made that strategic decision, I don't think he's going to be misled.
What would be the motive to say it and not do it?
Well, look, it's possible. I hope this is not true, but it's possible. They think in North Korea they can do the same thing to us they've done to 3 previous administrations and negotiate, buy time, get resources in exchange for commitments they don't intend to live up to. I think they're going to find they've got a different president here, somebody who knows how to make a deal and enforce it, and we'll see what happens.
One of the things that's been pointed out is that North Korea's made an announcement they're going to freeze their testing. There are also reports that where they did their testing last September, that mountain that has collapsed, and there could be an ecological disaster. The whole area could be contaminated. Do you have any information as to whether they announced they're freezing their testing because they're doing it as part of good faith gesture to the United States and to the discussions, or is it because they got trouble?
Look, it's possible it's part of a good faith gesture. It's entirely possible that's what they're doing. It's also possible, as we've seen in cases like Iran or North Korea itself, they've run into difficulties, so they're making a virtue out of necessity. I hope it's the former, but one of the reasons that the short period of time between the agreement to meet between the 2 leaders and the actual meeting is important is North Korea is not going to get a lot of benefit here out of a lengthy negotiation. This is going to be very quick. I think the 2 sides will size each other up, and President Trump will have a chance to look Kim in the eye and decide whether he really is serious.
Is the serious on the June 12th, is it going to be, are you willing to give up the nuclear weapons totals? That's going to be the questions put on the table. Yeah,
look, denuclearization has a history here. In 1992, the North Koreans agreed not only to give up nuclear weapons, but to give up the front end, uranium enrichment, and the back end, plutonium reprocessing. So we're not really asking them on the nuclear side to do more than what they agreed to before. We are also going to talk about chemical and biological weapons. We're going to talk about their missiles. We're going to talk about their abduction of Japanese and South Korean citizens. We've got our 3 American hostages out, so that's good news. But I think it's all right there. And if the North Korean regime has made that critical strategic decision to get out of the weapons of mass destruction business, then we have a chance for progress.
But why are they selling? This is what I don't understand, is that not only are they making the announcement, at least we're reading about it, that they're willing to denuclearize and that they've frozen their testing, but they also returned 3 Americans, and they haven't sort of asked for any quid pro quo. You know, what's your thinking about what's going on in their mind?
Look, if you believe after evaluation that you're actually safer and better off without pursuing nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons, it's not hard to give them up, because you're getting to a better place. You're getting to real security rather than the false security of a weapons program. Whether they've made that decision or not, we can't tell.
But why now? And they've got a history. It's not like they've got a history of taking care of their people, worrying about the security of their people. I mean, their people have been starving. You hear horrible stories about the prison camps that they have. Like, why suddenly would he suddenly care about his people and care about the security?
Because they've never seen the level of economic and political pressure that's been put on them by the president's campaign. But we've got the meeting now, and so I think that's accomplished its objective. Now the test is, are they serious? Will they go ahead?
Has China stepped up its commitment to this? Because I thought it was interesting that not only that Kim Jong-un made one trip, but made a second trip to China right away. Do you see a change in sort of how China's approaching this?
Well, the president had an excellent conversation with Xi Jinping just a few days ago. He's made it very clear we're not letting up on the pressure while the preparations for the meeting go ahead. So this is, in effect, a test for China as well, whether they're prepared to back an effort much more serious than earlier negotiations like the six-party talks, but where the parties get to the end result in very short order. This isn't going to drag out for a long period of time, and that'll be part of the demonstration of sincerity on North Korea's side.
Have they asked for anything from us? They've returned the 3 Americans, and they say they're going to do, or at least the reports are, the denuclearize. Have they said, but when you come here, you better be prepared to X?
Yeah, well, they want a peace treaty. They want an end to the hostilities on the Korean Peninsula. The South Koreans want the same thing. Look, we all want peace on the Korean Peninsula after all these years. And we can get to that, but to get to that, there has to be complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization. That is absolutely clear.
What about our troops in South Korea? Is that on the table?
No, they're not a bargaining chip here. Look, if one day the two Koreas reunited, you'd have a different strategic situation. That's nowhere close to where we are now.
And is South Korea willing to sign a peace agreement to end that war with North Korea?
Well, I think the South Koreans have been very open and transparent with us. I must say we've had excellent conversations between President Moon Jae-in, President Trump, my South Korean counterpart, Mike Pompeo, and the South Korean foreign minister. Cooperation could not be better. They'd like to see this succeed, but they understand, and very clearly, that they don't get to that question until we get denuclearization.
Okay, so we'll know things pretty quickly, or at least the president and his team will know things pretty quickly after June 12th. Let's assume that this goes south and that President Trump decides that Kim Jong-un didn't come with good heart and good mind to talk about doing this, and he has no intention. Then what?
Well, you don't want to predict the worst result coming out of it, but the president himself has said if he doesn't think it's serious, he's prepared with respect to get up and walk away. We'll see.
Walk away and do what, though? Because their nuclear weapons program has been progressing and the clock is running.
And the economic pressure has been progressing too. That's why I think the president is hopeful that maybe there really is a change in behavior. We've never been at this point before. It's
pretty interesting, isn't it? I mean, this is a big chance for Japan, for China, for the rest of the world.
The stakes have never been higher, but I don't think we would have been here if President Trump had followed the same policies as previous administrations. A lot of people said, this is very risky the way he's proceeding, but the upside here is potentially enormous.
Do you intend to go?
I'll be there. I wouldn't miss it.
And you've never been there before?
No, and it'll be quite an experience to meet the North Koreans.
What has Secretary Pompeo said about it? He's now been there twice.
Yeah, look, he's had very successful meetings. I think a lot of the progress can be attributed to his diplomacy, and he can see how the potential here for a really historic change coming just 6 weeks after he took office. The president clearly understands this. It's a big challenge for all of us. There's a lot of work to do between now and June 12th.
Let me switch to the other part of the world, to Afghanistan. Is there any indication that the United States will go into direct talks with the Taliban?
Well, I think there's a lot more to do in terms of strengthening our ability to prevent the terrorists from taking over again and from carrying out terrorist attacks in the United States. We've been around a lot of iterations on this since September the 11th, and I think that the commitment to making sure that we've got adequate resources there to prevent terrorist attacks here remains top of mind for us.
But does that mean we'll negotiate with Taliban?
Well, I think what we want is the Afghan government to take the lead in this, and we'll see there if the Taliban and all of the various other factions that are involved in threatening the Afghan government are really interested in a negotiation that could lead to peace.
If Iran does get started again on its missile program in earnest, what's going to happen with Saudi Arabia? Are they going to get into an arms race? Do they want to get into this with them?
Look, I think one of the consequences of the Iran nuclear deal was to help facilitate an arms race in the Middle East. It's not only the case that Israel doesn't want Iran to have deliverable nuclear weapons, neither do any of the other countries, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf countries. And one of the fears I think that we have is that the failings of the Iran deal, the ability of Iran to continue to pursue nuclear weapons, simply incentivizes other countries to create their own indigenous nuclear capability. So unless this deal were eliminated, you would have laid the groundwork for a nuclear arms race in the world's most volatile region.
Where's Putin been on all these discussions? He's been relatively silent in Russia on whether it's the Iran deal. We haven't seen a lot about him, or even North Korea.
Well, I think Russia's in a difficult position in a lot of respects. The president has put in a lot of very tough sanctions on Russia. I don't think he gets adequate credit for that. There's a lot of politics involved here in this country. The president's actions against Russia have been very strong. And I think the Russians have felt that. Now, they've also been out trying to extend their influence in Ukraine, other places in Central and Eastern Europe, in Syria, in the Middle East. So there's a lot on the agenda with Russia. And I think some of the steps we've taken, they have not expected either. I think President Trump has demonstrated he's obviously not Barack Obama, but he's not others of his predecessors either.
You know, it's sort of interesting to watch the world. I mean, the United States is hoping to get help with North Korea from China, yet at the same time, China is developing a bigger footprint in Africa. As we have more trouble with Pakistan, they're getting more involved with Pakistan. It seems like in some instances that that they're encroaching in different parts of the world.
Look, China is definitely using the benefits of 30 years of economic growth. They've taken advantage of what happens when you move away from a Marxist economic system. They've put a lot of money into their military. They're trying to expand their influence all around China's periphery, in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, in India, with the so-called One Belt, One Road project all over Central Asia, the Maritime Silk Road. They're pressing out in a lot of ways, and I think the world's looking to see how the United States reacts to it. Frankly, until this administration, we've barely reacted at all, and I think that's changing now.
What about the South Sea? China seems to be expanding the South Sea. They're creating these islands and appear to be military bases. I mean, they're expanding into the South Sea, and you've got the Philippines very distressed by it. You've got Japan, and I mean, that's where so much shipment, so much sea transport goes through that area. And it seems that China is moving into there pretty heavily.
Yeah, this is clearly something that we're going to have to deal with, this expansion, this militarization of the South China Sea. We also have enormous trade issues with China, and that's on the table now in ways that even some of the president's opponents have recognized that he's taken a very strong line. Tom Friedman and others in the New York Times, really kind of interesting to watch. But that means you have to have a comprehensive strategy to deal with China, and that's something that I think we're seeing in this administration we haven't seen before.
What about our neighbor, Venezuela?
Well, look, it's a tragedy what's happening there under Chavez and Maduro. The economy has collapsed. People are really in difficult shape. The influence of Cuba has grown. You know, in Latin America, they sometimes call the problem Cubazuela because of the Cuban influence there. I think, as we just saw in the recent Summit of the Americas, Vice President Pence represented the United States. The Latin American countries see this as a real problem, not just for the United States, but for the entire hemisphere. If you could have a real free and fair election in Venezuela, Maduro would be out the door. But he's created, after Chavez, a really repressive system, and it's a deep problem. So
is it the United States' position sort of just to sit and watch, or what is our strategic program?
Well, I think what we've indicated is that increasing the pressure and the exposure about what's actually happening in Venezuela is something that hopefully the other Latin American countries will come together on. It also ties into what the president did in Cuba, where he essentially substantially reversed what the Obama administration did because of the continued abuses of human rights there. So it's, this is still in the works, but it's not something that we should find acceptable to see these kinds of authoritarian regimes in the Western Hemisphere.
But it doesn't get a lot of attention in the media. I don't read much about Venezuela, and it's so close to the United States.
Yeah, and it's really the devastating impact on the lives of the people in Venezuela isn't much appreciated here either. And that's something that we tried to highlight at the Summit of the Americas. And as I say, I think around Latin America, it's pretty hard to find anybody who's willing to defend Maduro and his regime.
So how's the job?
It's great. I must say, it's even better than being a Fox News contributor.
What'd you wear for you? How about you an ambassador? How about you an ambassador?
No, look, it's an honor to serve the country. It's an honor to give the President advice. I'm very clear what my role is. I'm the National Security Advisor. I'm not the National Security Decision Maker. And you get a chance to present your views. My job is really to make sure everybody who's got a stake in an issue gets to present their views, and then the President decides.
Is it a lot different on the inside than the outside? I mean, as we sit on the outside and try to watch to see what's going on in this administration or any administration, do you on the inside think if you only knew?
Well, I think it's even more acute in this administration. The difference between the way you read about the administration in the press and sort of my experience in the West Wing every day, it's not only is it not like the television West Wing, it's not like what you read in the newspapers or see on the news. It's a completely different atmosphere. I think it's much more constructive. We're actually getting a lot done, and I wish people would focus on the substance of the policy instead of the imaginary politics.
How do we bridge that gap, though? Because the media needs to get information, and how do we bridge the gap with the administration?
Well, I think the bias of the press here is much more pronounced than in prior administrations. I've been in only Republican administrations where I think the bias of the press has been pretty clear, but it's worse in this administration. I think it's very hard to get a fair treatment. If we could do interviews and get coverage that focused on policy, people can have different views on policy, but that's what's going on. It's not a Game of Thrones where you sort of count who's up and who's down on any given day.
Well, it certainly seems that it's not dull.
It's a lot of fun.
Indeed it is. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much.
Thank you.